Okay. Good morning. I'd like to welcome everyone to the 26th meeting in 2012 of the Local Government and Regeneration Committee. As usual, can I ask everyone to ensure they have switched off mobile phones and other electronic equipment, please. If we can move on to agenda item 1, which is subordinate legislation. The first item of business today is consideration of a negative statutory instrument. That's the Town and Country Planning General Permitted Development Fish Farming Scotland Amendment Number 2 Order 2012, SSI 2012/285. The Sub-Ledge Committee has considered this instrument and does not have any issues to draw to the attention of the committee. Do members have any comments to make on the instrument? Are members content not to make any recommendations on this instrument? Thank you. Agenda item 2, Commission for Ethical Standards in Public Life in Scotland Annual Report 2011-12. Item 2 in our agenda is the consideration of that annual report. I'd like to welcome Stuart Allen, Public Standards Commissioner for Scotland, and David Sillars, Senior Investigating Officer, Commission for Ethical Standards in Public Life in Scotland. Welcome, gentlemen. Mr. Allen, would you like to make some opening remarks to the committee, please?
Thank you, Convener, for that very warm welcome. I'm delighted to be here this morning and to report on the work of the Standards Commissioner's Office in relation to councillors and members of public bodies. As you say, I am the Public Standards Commissioner, but this is the first occasion when I have reported formally to the Scottish Parliament. Up until now, we have reported to Scottish ministers, but as a result of the Scottish Commissions Act of 2010, we now report to the Parliament itself. There is a note before you listing the main items I'm happy to talk about this morning. Now, the first area of work really relates to the codes of conduct, and there are codes of conduct for councillors, for members of devolved public bodies, and for MSPs. In regard to the latter codes for MSPs, I report directly to the Standards Committee. Now, there is appended to the note a set of procedures for complaints. It explains how we go about dealing with complaints, the modus operandi for dealing with the complaint process. And I'm not intending to go through that, but if there are any questions about the process at all, Convener, very happy to deal with them. I've also circulated or attached to the note the annual report. And I'd just like to make a couple of points regarding the annual report. First of all, if I could refer to Table 1, it gives you an idea of the number of public office holders for whom we're responsible. There are 2,700 public office holders, councillors, members of public bodies, MSPs, that are obliged to comply with the various codes of conduct. Secondly, I just refer briefly to Table 2, which is the number of complaints about councillors or members of public bodies. Now, in the last year, 2011-12, there was something like a 7.5% drop compared with 2 years before. And in my view, that is an indicator, no more than that, but an indicator that there are increasingly high standards of conduct in public life. But no doubt I'll come back to that under questions, Convener. The type of complaints we receive are set out in Table 3, and at this stage I would simply say we continue to see a fair number of complaints about the registration and the declaration of interests. And we also continue to receive a fair number of complaints about planning. Outcome of complaints completed are set out in Table 7, and the breaches that we've reported upon to the Standards Commission are set out in Table 8. Only some 3% of complaints end up as a breach report to the Standards Commission. And then finally, on pages 19 to 23 of the annual report, I give a summation or a review of the year. And just to make a couple of points there, I emphasise again the importance that I do attach to the reduction and continuing reduction in the number of complaints we receive. As I say, I think that is indicative of high standards. And secondly, I repeat, because I said this in earlier reports as well, that councillors particularly must attach greater importance to the Code of Conduct provisions on declaration of interest. And I think that local authorities themselves can assist their members in taking greater cognizance of these provisions. Finally, regarding continuing public service reform, I'm sure your committee is aware, Convener, that the Government and the Parliament have agreed that later on this year they will promote an order under the Public Services Reform Act to combine the posts of Public Standards Commissioner and Public Appointments Commissioner into a single Commissioner, which I think will lead to increased efficiencies in both offices. And as I say, Convener, I'm very happy to take questions on any matters that you wish to raise.
Thank you very much. Can I, first of all, ask you, Mr. Allen, you talked about the reduction in complaints, and you said that that probably shows a driving up of standards. Is there any evidence that there has been a reduction in complaints because people don't feel that their complaint is being dealt with properly?
I don't think that is an issue at all, Convener. First of all, I think it is interesting to look at the statistics generally, and you will see a reduction over the last 5 years. And I'm pretty confident that that is because councillors particularly are very aware of the provisions of the Code of Conduct, and therefore the way they conduct themselves in public office is to a higher standard than before. Now, the second aspect of your question really is, are people losing confidence in the system? And I don't think that's the case at all. We attach a huge importance to ensuring that people who submit a complaint receive a thoroughly reasoned judgment, so that when they receive our note of decision, they can understand precisely why we have said there is a breach, or often there is not a breach. And we get a significant amount of feedback from complainants saying, all right, they perhaps would have preferred a different outcome, but they appreciate the thorough and fair way the process has been conducted. And that is certainly very much part of our experience. There will, of course, be people who remain dissatisfied. That is, I'm afraid, part of the regulatory process itself in the wider context.
I should declare an interest as a former councillor who's been complained about to the Commission as well, I should say. I have to say that that complaint was not upheld. Where you have situations, which I'm sure happens on a number of occasions, where that complaint is shown not to stack up very, very quickly, can I ask why it is in some occasions it takes quite a long time to get back to the complainer and the person who has been complained about with your findings?
Well, I think there are a couple of points here. First of all, the process itself means that we undertake an initial investigation of the complaint. And if we feel that the complaint is not meeting the key tests of relevancy or admissibility, then at a comparatively early stage, we will dismiss the complaint. And that is done by letter, albeit with reasons. And the large majority of complaints are dealt with in that way. Complaints that require further investigation inevitably take longer because it's essential that there is complete thoroughness attached to the investigation, and there can be a whole range of reasons why matters drag on. Mostly it is because the ingathering of the key evidence takes longer than we would like to see. We've got to interview the key parties involved, take evidence from them, and then reach a conclusion on that. But if I can, I would like to just refer to the table in the annual report, which explains what our targets have been against how quickly we've been set the task of concluding the investigations. And you will find, and this is set out in table 15A, that we have targets. For example, 40% have to be completed within 3 months or less. Our target, our actual performance is 76%. We have a target of completing complaints within 6 months of 75%. The actual performance is 94%. And the target...
Mr. Allen, I think my point is this,
yes.
That, you know, if you are not guilty of something, you know that you're not guilty, you still have that sword of Damocles hanging over you in terms of the press and the public for that period of time thinking, is he or she guilty or not? You know, and that can lead to a huge amount of media coverage over something. And if it is shown at the very beginning that there's nothing to answer for, why can something not be dealt with quicker?
Well, let me deal up front with that last point. You say there's nothing to substantiate. Now, that, in my view, is showing at least some disrespect to the complainant. There are very, very few complaints that don't have some substance to them. There are next to no complaints where you can tell when you open the page that there is nothing to answer. That's the first point. I think the second point is you have two parties that have an interest in the complaint. The complainer, of course, and the respondent. And the thing to do is to come to a decision as quickly as possible given the whole circumstances of the case. And if we can do that, and if we can write a reasoned note that people can then rely on, the press can pick up on the full reasons behind the complaint and the reasons for dismissing the complaint. If we can do that as quickly as possible, that's all we can do. But let me finish on this point. If people choose to use the complaint system for, say, personal or political motives, there is next to nothing I can do about that. That is part of the political process. It's part of the democratic process. And it's not possible to say we will not go about a thorough investigation in order to take a view prematurely on whether a complaint has substance.
I have a number of colleagues who'd like to come in. Anne McTaggart first, please, then Stuart McMillan, then Stuart Stevenson, please.
Still remaining on the same point, Mr. Allen. It's saying here 76% within 3 months or less. I still even think that 3 months is a long, long time. If these complaints were dealt with effectively, efficiently, it then doesn't enable arms and legs to grow out of them, and it doesn't cause stress for both the complainer and the person who's been complained against. 3 months is a long, long time. Far less, I know that some go on after 9 months.
Well, it's very difficult for me to say that is unreasonable. I think these are exceptionally good figures. If you compare them with other regimes, either in Scotland or in the other ethical standards frameworks that have existed throughout the United Kingdom, these are exceptionally good figures. You say that 3 months. Well, these have been achieved within 3 months. They're not all taken as long as that. But you have to consider the complaint. You have to pass it on to the respondent and invite the respondent to give his or her views on the matter. You have to conduct at least an initial investigation, which involves going to the local authority, usually to the chief executive or to the monitoring officer, and find out what the background is. You may indeed carry out some interviews on the whole process. Now, to do that in significantly less than 3 months is just not realistic.
Tend to disagree with that.
Stuart McMillan, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, gentlemen. I've just got one question and 1 point for clarification. On page 16, table 10, the second last line there, the engagement and liaison with constituents. I'm just seeking some clarification on what that actually means. Obviously, I'm not looking for any specifics. But,
well,
just
this is in
Mr. Allen,
to MSPs,
can I say to Mr. McMillan, you've moved on to MSPs. That's actually the responsibility of the Standards Committee. And in the main today, we're looking at council aspects. If Mr. McMillan wants to frame his question round about the council aspects, that's fine. But we need to steer away from the MSP scenario, Stuart, because
I was just seeking clarification because I don't understand what that means. That was all.
Maybe you could clarify the point.
Yes. This really is about the performance of MSPs as perceived by their constituents, and if they feel that the MSP has not been performing adequately, then there can be an issue relating to the code of conduct. But in those circumstances, I do not have jurisdiction as the Standards Commissioner. It's a matter for the presiding officer.
Okay, thanks. Stuart, sorry.
Question, just as, in terms of this report and kind of previous reports, has there been an increase in complaints when there has been a local authority election? Or just after a local authority election, have you noticed a spike in complaints?
Well, it's a very interesting question, that. And it can vary from election to election. Sometimes we have had a significant rise, usually in the 5 months before an election. And sometimes we haven't. And last year, we didn't have an appreciable rise. We had a rise of a limited note, but not an appreciable one. And I'm afraid I don't have a ready answer as to why the last election there wasn't such an increase as before. And I'm afraid that is it.
Well, that's good. Thank you very much.
Okay. Stuart Stevenson, please.
Thank you very much, Convener, and as someone who too has been complained about, I can speak highly of the process, and not just because the outcome was what I expected it to be. The poor soul who complained was somebody with mental health problems, and I think that was the origin of the complaint. However, I must say, I think looking at the numbers and looking at what's happening, all of us who are involved in public life should probably pat ourselves relatively on the back. The number of complaints that are sustained is extremely low. And I just wondered, in the light of that observation, whether you're able to make any comparisons with other jurisdictions within the UK or internationally, because it does strike me that while there is considerable public debate about standards in public life, what is before us here suggests that we actually are operating to very high standards. But is that suggestion by me justified when you look at other jurisdictions?
Well, I think what I can say is that the the ethical standards framework in Scotland, first of all, is very widely embraced by members of Parliament, by councillors and members of public bodies. It's part of our ethos in public service these days. I'm not sure that's entirely shared even across the United Kingdom. But we start off on the basis that we have adopted the Nolan Principles, we've adopted readily our Code of Conduct, and we've adopted the process. Now, the process itself could easily become part of a problem. And it's very important, in my view, that we do things proportionately and fairly and effectively. You can get a situation when the regime, as did happen in England, became part, I think, of the problem itself. It was too bureaucratic. It took far too long in making decisions. And there was, I think, a limited amount of respect given by stakeholders to the Standards Board work. Now, up here we have very much tried to bring a huge amount of common sense to the process. I know it's a phrase that's not used much these days. We've tried to look at complaints with a great deal of common sense and adopt a proportionate way as to how we deal with specific complaints. And I think that has given us a credibility that has not been shared in other parts of the United Kingdom. If I may just give one perhaps practical example. In Scotland, at a very early date, we were faced with complaints about councillors that really related to their conduct, primarily in private life. And at an early stage, we said the code is related purely to the conduct that they undertake as part of their duties as councillors. And just because someone is called from day to day councillor blogs does not mean that he always has his council hat on. So at a very early stage, we said private conduct is not caught by the code. England took a quite different view. And so that private conduct in England was drawn into the investigations undertaken by the Standards Board. That is just an example of how I think we have dealt with matters in a more straightforward and I think appropriate way. You will find that if you look back at the cases that have gone through the courts in England, the courts have in fact favoured the Scottish approach and have said so at High Court level in England. Now, the fact that we have approached matters generally and hopefully with a great deal of support from the local authorities and public bodies themselves for what we do in promoting the codes, I think we've achieved a pretty high level of satisfaction. Regulators can never get much more than that. I think if people are reasonably satisfied with what they do, then I think I, for my part, would be satisfied with that performance.
John Wilson, then Margaret Mitchell, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Mr Allen. Just a couple of questions. Interested in the report and some of the figures in the report, and while you're saying that things seem to be going down, clearly in Table 3, failures to declare an interest actually increased by over 100% year on year. In terms of failure to declare an interest, rose from 19 in 2009-10, 19 2010-11, and jumped to 42 in 2011-12. Is there any analysis been done why there's been such a large jump year on year in terms of the failure to declare an interest? Is that, given that we were at the end of the 5-year cycle of councillors' elected positions, what happened here?
Yes, I think that's a very fair point. I mentioned declaration of interest at the start. If you can just take one step back, if you look at the matters that are dealt with in the code, I always regard it as a pyramid, and the ones that are really, really important at the top are registration of interests, and at the very top, declaration of interests, because that is where the public are expected to see that their elected members have acted with all due integrity and propriety. In fact, at one time in local government, the failure to register and the failure to declare interest was a criminal offence. In fact, it was really the only matter that was regulated by statute in relation to councillors until the Code of Conducts were introduced, and the matter was made part of the civil law. I think that the statistics themselves last year disclosed a higher number than usual, because there were a couple of multiple complaints. A complaint can relate to 2 or 3 councillors, so the numbers went up in that particular year. But nevertheless, the number of complaints we have in relation to that is unacceptably high. Often the reason is that councillors do not properly perceive the problems that they may have in a debate. They don't properly perceive their interests, and they don't really understand how their interests might be seen by members of the public to be forming an influence on their conduct in the chamber. And I feel that councillors should be much more open in seeking advice from their senior officers, such as their chief executives and their monitoring officers. But too often they wait until they're actually in the chamber itself, and then they look around almost for advice. That is too late. It's also too late to go to the chief executive or the director of law 2 minutes before a meeting starts and say, by the way, could you give me some advice about this? My auntie Jeannie actually owns the house next door to this site, which is up for planning permission. It's too late to get proper, reasoned, sound advice. So the lesson that I try to get over to councillors is, if you think you've got any sort of problem, then act on that and go and see your senior officers and get advice about that. The second thing is what the councils themselves should be doing about this. And we've said in the last 2 reports that councils themselves should be more proactive in talking to their councillors and trying to show them how matters should be considered in relation to issues where there might be a potential interest they have to declare. So that's what I'd like to see the councils more proactively doing something on that score. And I don't really think, in overall Scottish terms, all authorities are doing enough there. Now, the last point here is that the Sanders Commission and ourselves are embarking and have embarked this year on tours around Scotland and the local authorities to explain the code in more detail. We're very encouraged by the response we have this year, and we have in fact set a target of trying to meet all individual local authorities, and the response to that has been very good indeed. But that gives us the opportunity of talking one-to-one to councillors about this important area, and to embed in their minds, just how much importance they have to attach to the matter of their private interests.
I thank Mr Allen for his response, but I would just let's go into that 42 figure. You gave an indication that might relate to a number of multiple complaints. How many multiple complaints have we
I can give you figures. The figures in overall terms were higher than the previous years, though. I think we can accept that entirely.
No, as I said, I'm just trying to get down to the position where there is an issue arising where there's been multiple complaints or complainants in terms of because there's been a decision at, say, a planning committee meeting of a council where a number of members sitting in that planning committee about to make a decision. There's been, say for instance, a number of them have met with the developer and haven't declared that prior to the meeting. How would that issue have been dealt with? And that's a hypothetical issue. I'm not saying that councillors regularly meet with developers.
Yes, no, and I'd like to dispel that actually right away. There's no suggestion that is happening on a regular basis. If there are meetings with developers, then it is normally through the offices of the planning department. And in the year in question, there was no element of that appearing in this table here. There were issues about failing to register and declare interest in relation to planning matters. In fact, one of our breach cases did involve a failure to deal properly with a planning application, and that led to suspension and so on. Just to mention about the statistics, if we have 3 people separately complaining about one councillor, that is statistically logged as 3 complaints, because there could be 3 outcomes, and that's how it is done, even although it's about the same issue. Equally, if a single complainant reports on 3 councillors, that's also 3 complaints for obvious reasons. But I'm happy to give more breakdown information about these statistics if the committee wish.
Useful, Mr. Allen. Mr. Wilson.
I've still got. Like to pursue further. Mr. Allen made reference to the monitoring officer and the chief executive of local authorities. Do you think there is enough information at local authority level between the monitoring officers and the chief executives to give correct guidance to elected members? After all, it's only elected members that are actually dealt with under this process, not council officials or council employees. Do you think there's enough advice given from the start of the time that they are elected and during the business of the council to councillors to make sure they don't fall in, or potentially lead to a breach in the standards?
Yes. Almost all local authorities have an induction process when people become elected, and the code of conduct and matters such as interests are dealt with very fully at these induction sessions. And they are, yes,
Mr. Allen,
indeed.
because you're saying that these are dealt with very fully at these induction meetings. Can I ask if you've ever attended any of these induction meetings of late?
No, but I am satisfied that from all the discussions I've had with both elected members and chief executives, that they have a full process, and normally as part of their induction process they have a session on the code of conduct. But let me go back to what I was saying. That is what happens in the first 2 or 3 months after an election. But what happens after that is there is not a regular feedback on these matters. And through a process of time, I think councillors become less than aware of what their responsibilities are. So it is important to refresh their knowledge on interests particularly. And I think that's where local authorities could step up a little bit.
I wonder if Mr. Allen has done any analysis in relation to what prior to 2007 and the number of complaints prior to that date. The reason why I'm making the reference to 2007, Convener, is that since 2007, elected members have received a remuneration for the duties they undertake. And as per the appendix that's been included with the report, highlights that elected members have been suspended in some cases for up to 3 months from attending council meetings. But the point I'm coming to, Convener, is while they may be suspended from attending council meetings, committee meetings and full council, their constituents still expect them to carry out their duties as an elected member and still deal with constituent complaints and inquiries. How does that relate to the issue about the loss of remuneration for that individual under the current guidance and the current code? Because while there's a suspension from attending council meetings and full council, that individual is still carrying out their duties, and it may be their only source of income for undertaking that work.
Mr. Allen?
Yes. The position is that if a member is suspended as a result of a Standards Commission decision, they still receive their ordinary remuneration. If they are entitled to a special allowance because they're the chairman of a committee and so on, the guidance from the Commission is that the local authority should reconsider whether they are in receipt of that level of remuneration. But the basic allowance is still paid to the councillor, conscious that he or she is still undertaking a fairly heavy workload as a constituent councillor.
Right, thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Margaret Mitchell, then John Pentland, please.
Morning.
Good morning.
Probably in the first instance I wanted to ask about training, but I think you've covered that fairly well. I still think, the induction is all very well just to give a pointer that there may be issues, but given the volume of work that new councillors are faced with, I question just how much they take in at that stage. And I think, therefore, to revisit this, not just in 2 or 3 months' time, but reasonably regularly as issues of declaration and code of conduct will come up in various committees might be something worth looking at. But I'm very encouraged that you're conscious of that and these recommendations.
Can I just take that point, actually? That was very much in our mind after the last elections. We knew that after May 12, there were to be induction sections all across the 32 local authorities. But the Standards Commission, along with ourselves, felt we should go that step further and go, if we possibly could, to every local authority and try and encourage all the members of that authority to come along and have a session about the range of matters covered in the code, particularly interests and so on. Now, we're halfway through that process now. David's going off to East Renfrewshire next week. I'm going to be up to Murray and so on. We're more than halfway there. These have been really helpful indeed. If you have a regional meeting, as we used to have, we got so many local authorities coming along, and then a small percentage of councillors within each local authority. If we go out to each one, it's having a real impact, and so that's a good thing. But I think we've got to keep doing that, actually, and so I think that's very much behind our thinking.
Yes, so as I say, that's very welcome, especially as people are elected in by-elections. And if you are going to comment, Mr. Stillers, could you perhaps cover the devolved public bodies where there may also be councillors represented in one form or another?
Yeah, I was just going to really reinforce what Stuart had said about the layered approach, if you want, to improving training and awareness and so on. And I was kind of reflecting earlier on about the discussion about stakeholders in the public sector buying into ethical standards. And I suppose the way that I'd been thinking about it being a little bit more out in the councils and so on is that the framework is now pretty much wallpaper that people are aware of, and I think that has done a great deal towards generally raising standards. But in relation to the specifics, I think the way that we have reorganised the contribution that we make to the councils and meeting them on an individual basis has really improved the
frankly, the amount of interface between ourselves and individual councillors, and I think that's been very good. I think the other thing that certainly I can't speak universally in respect of councils, but there are some very good practice in councils that MOs and chief executives have encouraged in terms of emphasising to members the point that Stuart again was making earlier about the need for early transparency, and that's very much a facet of the process designed to protect members and so on. And I mean, I appreciate that you know, you would probably expect me to say that, but I think that is very important. As Stuart says, it's absolutely no use as you sidle into the council chamber and a member says, "I was wondering if I could speak to you about my friend." You know, I think that's. But from what I can see, over the past 4 or 5 years, all of that has improved, I think, and continues to improve. As I said, not least because people have bought into it. So, really, that was what I wanted to say in relation to the generality. But you have a point about
Involved public bodies to the training there for members.
The same. We take the same general approach to devolved public bodies. There is a great deal less activity in terms of the codes in relation to devolved bodies, but we certainly, along with the Standards Commission, are involved in regular meetings with the standards officers from the devolved bodies, and try to take the same approach in relation to them. But as I say, no doubt, simply because of the nature of the beast and the higher profile of the political activity in relation to councils, in relation to devolved bodies, we have a significantly less amount of business.
Thank you for that. Can I ask a little bit about the note of decision if a breach is not found to have taken place and the complaint isn't upheld? Is the note of decision retained?
Yes, the note of decision is retained indefinitely. What we also do is, and this comes back to the point about councillors often feeling that they've been the subject to a press story about it, and they've not really been able to respond adequately because they're under the cloud of an investigation. What we try and do is write the note of decision as clearly and articulately as possible to explain what we've considered and how we've come to the conclusion that the respondent, the councillor, did not contravene the code. That is then put into a summary version which contains still all the reasoned arguments and is put on the web. And that often appears in a form in the press. So to some extent, the councillor is vindicated, if that's what's appropriate, by being the subject of a press article that is based entirely on what our conclusions have been. So any imbalance that appeared in the press suggesting that the councillor was doing something wrong is redressed to some extent by the reasoned note, which is available on the web.
Yes, I've got mixed feelings about this. You know,
yes.
One part of me thinks, well, of course, once it's published, that deals with the situation. And then I wonder about the retention, because it's almost no smoke without fire. It's there for posterity. And I wonder about the fairness of that.
I think that's a very fair point. I think there is an issue about how long we do keep it. To some extent, we have kept notes of decision and web summaries to build up a case law on ethical standards, and it's widely sought by officials in local government. It's looked at a lot, and that's quite important. But there must come a point when the issue is, but do you have to retain all this about individual people. For example, if we take it out, slightly move it to MSPs, if I may, convener, just for a second. With MSPs, yeah, I might get you in trouble.
Standards Committee, Mr.
Right.
Allen, very briefly.
With MSPs, nothing appears on the web. There is no publication of no breach decisions at all, because that is what the Parliamentary Act requires. That is not part of the process in local government, where there is a more open and transparent aspect to it. I think one thing is for sure, I think we do need to publish decisions or to make them available on the web to redress the imbalance that was caused by an inaccurate report in the press, really led by complainants about the issue. And I think we do have to have that so that the matter is resolved to the public's satisfaction.
There's just one last question. The sanctions that you have in terms of a breach being upheld, or censure, suspension, disqualification, all very punitive sanctions. I'm comparing them with some of the sanctions that are open to the Ombudsman, for example. And one particular area which I have an interest in is apologies. You know, sometimes if there was the ability to have an apology, that's acknowledging again the incident, perhaps, you know, expressing regret, and also seeing if, you know, lessons could be learned from it. Would that be something that you think might give the complainant more closure and more satisfaction that something had actually been done to take on board the issue and try and make sure it doesn't happen again?
Yes, the short answer to that is yes. You do get complaints where you say to yourself, if the councillor had just apologised for what he did, and if it's still timious to do that, we encourage the councillor to do that. You know, go up and see Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so, apologise to them and get it sorted out, because that's proportionate. That's proportionate. Sometimes councillors can be very slow in acknowledging they have done wrong, and it can often be very late on in the investigative process that they acknowledge that they have been in error. But providing even then that they do acknowledge that they were wrong and do apologise fully to the complainant, then that will have a significant mitigating effect.
Okay, thank you for that. That's helpful.
A wee supplementary from Stuart Stevenson and then John Pentland, please.
Yes, I just wanted to pick up on the point of retention of records. Given that the media will retain in their clippings libraries records for as long as they choose to do so, which generally means forever, would you think it important that the objective facts of decisions continue to be available indefinitely as a potential source of rebuttal for what may be less than objective material held in media libraries?
Yes, I take the view at the moment that unless there's legislation to the contrary, the decisions are formal decisions of the regulator and have to be left on the table in a similar way to court decisions. I think it would require legislation to say, well, you should get rid of your decision. I don't think that would, in overall terms, be in the public interest. Matters that are brought before the court are there in all time coming, and I don't see any reason to depart from that principle, actually.
John Pentland, please.
I think both Margaret Mitchell and Stuart have kind of opened the door for me, and it's with regards to the, you know, do you believe there is an unfairness in the process then, with regards to, you know, the councillor's code of conduct and the MSP's code of conduct, with regards to, and I know, Chair, that we don't want to talk about the MSPs, but I think it's quite important that, you know, under the MSP's code of conduct, there's admissible and inadmissible complaints can be taken forward And if that same sort of process was attributed to the councillors, perhaps we would not have, you know, the lengthy waiting times that sometimes happens, you know, from 3 months to 9 months, you know, because very, very quickly, you know, a decision has been made that this, you know, should not be taken forward because it's only purely an allegation. So my first question is on, do you think there's an unfairness, and do you think perhaps the legislation does need a change, you know, to give, you know, the councillors' code of conduct the same footing as that of the MSPs? And I think also the point where, you know, a decision is made and it's on the record forever and a day, I think it's probably, you know, whilst I can fully understand that it's always good to reference, you know, casework, I think sometimes if you're at the end of the stick where the allegation has been made in your part, you know, made against yourself and it's been totally unfounded, you know, it doesn't matter how many times people look at that, you know, if they look at it hard enough, the mud starts to stick. So I'm just wondering if perhaps the process should be sort of more aligned with that of councillors and MSPs. One, to me, it would help the process to be that wee bit more quicker. And secondly, it would sort of take away, you know, an unfounded allegation, which would then have to appear in, you know, wherever.
Mr. Allen?
Yes, well, I think superficially you could say why not have exactly the same investigative regime and the same reporting system and the same sanctions for all the public bodies in Scotland. But I think what has happened is you have had a regime that's been shaped and fashioned and designed for local government, basically what the Code of Conduct for Councillors is all about. And it suits the responsibilities that are undertaken by councillors. A completely separate thinking process went into the Code of Conduct for MSPs, and I think a very adequate framework was shaped there for the members of the Parliament who are involved in the legislative process. Now, the thing about the council process is that they are making hard decisions relating to individuals and specific matters on a day-in, day-out basis. Things like planning permission, housing applications, closing schools, social work cases, roads with potholes and so on. These are the things which get people upset about and often involve in quite complex complaints. So at the end of the day, I'm pretty satisfied that although we have slightly different regimes for the two strands in public life, I think they've been done deliberately, and I think there's still merit in keeping them separate at the present time. And I'd be, although, as I say, I think there might, on the face of it, be some merit in drawing them all together into a single process, I think it might, we might be throwing out the baby with the bathwater when if we were to do that.
I think, Chair, I would like probably Mr Allen then to maybe write and tell me, about, you know, probably to the committee, you know, with that view that you've just expressed there about why you should think, you know, they should still be separate. Because I believe that, you know, the Code of Conduct is there for elected members, and perhaps, you know, the process should not be different in that respect. My other question is on when a council has contravened the code, and again, it's a purely hypothetical in a sense that he then has time to make representation. Well, one, how long does he have to make representation, and how long does the Commission have to respond to that? And secondly, hypothetically, if this contravention was identified near the end of the councillor's term, and the time span that you apply for coming back goes into the next time for election, what happens then?
Well, right. As far as a contravention or an alleged contravention of the code is concerned, where we've had an investigation and we're clear there has been a contravention, the report is drafted, it then gets given to the councillor. and he's given a couple of weeks to respond. If he wants more time, he will get more time. His representations then form part of the report. Sometimes I may change parts of the report to accommodate what he has said. It will tend to be very minor points of clarification, however, and I cannot remember an instance when I've actually changed a material conclusion through representations. But his representations become part of the report which goes to the Standards Commission. It is then a matter for the Commission to decide whether to hold a hearing or not. And of course the respondent has the full opportunity to be legally represented at that hearing, which must decide whether the case that I've put forward is proven or not. It's proven on the balance of probabilities.
Just one thing. Who then sets the penalty for that contravention?
The Standards Commission, they decide whether the report which I say has concluded that there is contravention is upheld. And once they decide that, they will decide whether to, and they must decide one of three things: to censure, to suspend, or to disqualify. But that is the function of the Standards Commission for Scotland.
Stuart McMillan, please, supplementary there.
Thank you. Just it kind of follows on from John Pentland's question there, and it struck me that in the last 6 months of a council term, Councillor X has indicated that they're not going to be seeking re-election, but then a complaint is put in against Councillor X. And then by the time you undertake your initial investigations and say for talking sake that you were to find that councillor guilty, what would happen? Would there be any point in yourselves actually undertaking this type of inquiry or investigation?
Where a complaint is received prior to an election and it is known that the councillor is not standing again, then normally we consider that in the public interest it would be a waste of resources to investigate that. With one real exception, if we think that the allegation is so significant that it might, if proven, lead to disqualification, then we would proceed with the investigation. But that has never happened. It's never been at that level. And so that in almost all cases where someone has been is standing down, we explain to the complainant that we're not investigating in the public interest.
Okay, following on from that then, the same scenario applies, and then at the very last minute, if you yourselves had decided not to actually undertake the inquiry because the individual was standing down, and then at the very last minute, the day before close of nominations, that individual, the councillor, decided actually they were going to put their name forward because the initial person has pulled out for whatever reason, so they then put their name forward.
We wait until the close of nominations before we issue our formal decision that we're not proceeding further.
Right, okay, thank you.
Okay. Mr Wilson and then Mr Pentland.
Thank you, Convener. It's just to go back to the tables. In Table 4, you've listed the number of complainants, and I note that 3% or just over 3% of the complainants came from officers of a local authority. Now, just to try and clarify the role of the council's monitoring officer in relation to a complaint coming from, say, a senior officer of the council against an elected member, how would you advise that case to proceed? Because if the monitoring officer carries out functions on behalf of your organisation, but it's a senior official of the council that is making a complaint, is there not a conflict within the council structures in that situation if you're looking for a report from the monitoring officer?
Well, the short answer to that is yes. If the complaint comes in from a specific, let's take your example, the monitoring officer, then the contact officer for our purpose of the investigation would normally be the Chief Executive. We would not communicate with the monitoring officer, other than as a complainant, to seek his matters of explanation in relation to the complaint. But we would normally go direct to the Chief Executive and ask him to be the contact point for the purpose of the investigation.
I mean, if what I'm trying to draw out here is that there could be potentially a conflict in terms of the role of the monitoring officer and the Chief Executive. Because if you're saying the monitoring officer makes a complaint, then I'm sure most monitoring officers, and I'm not sure how monitoring officers operate in the 32 local authorities, but I'm sure most monitoring officers would not make a complaint about an elected member without seeking the approval or running that by their Chief Executive. Therefore, if a monitoring officer makes a complaint against an elected member, and then you bypass the monitoring officer and go to the Chief Executive, surely that decision's already been predetermined.
No, it's a matter for us to investigate and be absolutely satisfied about the actual facts of the case. When we contact a monitoring officer, it's really to facilitate the investigation. It's not to do any more than that. So far as I recall, the only occasion that a monitoring officer has submitted a complaint to me has been on instruction of his own counsel. He has not done it off his own bat. He's done it because the council...
That's the point I'm trying to make.
The council have made a decision about that. And therefore, the monitoring officer is simply carrying out his job by writing to us and saying a complaint is being made against a certain councillor and so on.
That was the point I was trying to make, Mr. Allen.
Indeed.
A monitoring officer in most cases would not act in their own initiative. They would seek the approval of either the...
Well, it tends to be the other way around, actually. The council have formed a view and therefore instructed the monitoring officer.
In that case, Mr. Allen, could you define council? Because there is two strands to a council. There's the officers of the council and there's the elected members of the council. Could you define council in those circumstances? Because it would be useful to find out from yourself how you determine who the council is in the case of making a complaint against an elected member. Because an elected member is, in some respects, part of the council.
In the specific circumstances you're talking about, we would regard the council as the complainer if it was a recorded decision of the council itself. If we received a complaint from a particular head of department or chief executive without council authority, we would regard that as a complaint by an officer.
That's fine. Okay. Mr. Pentland.
One small question, Convener. I think it probably referred to Mr. Sullers. As an investigating officer, I would assume that you're the person who would deal with the monitoring officer in respect of a complaint or allegation that's been made. Have you at any given time then reported back to the Commission and said that having spoken to the monitoring officer, I would find that this complaint or allegation is inadmissible and should not be taken forward?
Mr. Sellers.
Thank you. Well, I think we are careful at all stages to make an assessment of the relevance and admissibility of all complaints, and again, harking back to an earlier part of this discussion, we try to do that very quickly, and there's information in the report about that being done. If the information given by the monitoring officer, or indeed any other of our initial inquiries, flagged up that a particular complaint was inadmissible or not relevant, then at that stage we would close the complaint down.
Margaret Mitchell, please.
Just very briefly, the statutory offences that were in place before that made it an offence to to not declare a criminal offence, not to register a financial interest, clearly weren't included in the Ethical Standards in Public Life, etc. Scotland Act 2000. Do you think this aspect should be reviewed?
What I can say is that in the 40 years prior to the Local Government Act being repealed, there were no, as far as I recall, criminal prosecutions in Scotland. None. So there was an issue about whether anything was being achieved by having it a criminal offence.
I think that we're on the record here, and there are murmurings around about whether there were or were not. I think that as a committee we probably need to get clarification of whether or not there were those prosecutions over that period of time.
Well, you're certainly welcome, Chairman, but in my 40 years in local government, as far as I recall, there were no criminal prosecutions. So there was an issue about what was the appropriate way to regulate the matter, and Parliament was very clear it was important to decriminalise it, but bring in a civil regime, which the Code of Conduct is. And there have been a whole range of issues relating to declaration of issues, which have been looked at by the Commissioner and the Commissioner's Office and the Standards Commission in cases where there have been breach. And that's been, I think, the proportionate way of dealing with it. And I would think that is a proportionate approach to an important issue.
I only mention it because I think there was some disquiet that maybe wasn't sufficient discussion on the issue when the bill was passed or prior to the bill being passed. So perhaps in terms of post-legislative scrutiny, it's an aspect that could be looked once there's a kind of track record built up.
I noticed that in the notes that you had, but with respect, I don't entirely agree with that. It was given a considerable thought, because at that time, and those of you who were in local government may remember, it was decided not only to decriminalise the law on declaration, but to remove surcharge powers. And that was done both together quite deliberately. But it was done on the back of having an alternative regime, which was the Code of Conduct.
Thank you.
Mr. Pentland.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. It's just to go back to Mr. Sullers. With regards to when the complaint is inadmissible, does that become part of your overall figure of complaints against councillors? And if it is inadmissible, does that then become part of the public record that an allegation has been made against an individual?
Mr. Sellers.
Thank you. We will obviously include in our figures complaints made against councils and so on. You'll see, however, on table 2 there are a number of cases which are out with jurisdiction, which immediately appear to be for one reason or another. Perhaps the complaint is against an officer as opposed to a member of a council or a member of a devolved body. Then it will be apparent from the face of it that it's out with our jurisdiction, and that will be an end of the matter, and it'll be out with jurisdiction. Then there are complaints where further investigation is warranted to determine whether or not it's something that we would further investigate. So, for instance, there are we normally would not investigate an anonymous complaint. We normally would not investigate a complaint where the circumstances had happened more than a year ago, or where it had not become apparent to the complainant that there was something to complain about more than a year ago. Now, those are not those examples, and they are just examples, are not situations where you can immediately decide whether it's admissible or not, some further consideration needs to be given to it. As Stuart said earlier, an anonymous complaint, we would not embark on that normally unless there was some enormous significance to it, or there was a way of determining a link with the complainant and so on. So the admissibility process may be apparent from the complaint itself, or it may require some desktop investigation or indeed some other investigation and contribution from the complainant. We often write to complainants to ask them to focus on the specific part of the code that they feel has been breached.
Can I ask, gentlemen, this morning I declared a very tenuous interest. I was of a habit of declaring tenuous interests previously on council, because I think that's the way to be as open and transparent as you possibly can be. With the new regime change that we've had, a declaration means that you have to leave at that particular point. Do you think that some of the changes mean that there's less transparency than there once was?
I don't think the regime change of the new code in 2010 has meant that there's less openness and transparency. In fact, I think one of the principles behind the review was to make sure the code was still fit for purpose and satisfied the key Nolan principles.
Those tenuous declarations that there once were from very many members, which, if there had been that ability still to do so, may mean that you get less complaints than you currently do.
I was going on to say that councillors have to be very guarded in making declarations just because they think there might be some very tenuous connection to an item of business, because exactly as you say, Chair, particularly in the case of financial interests, that leads automatically to a requirement to leave the room and so on.
I don't think that any financial interest could ever be really tenuous in my opinion, but there are other things which obviously ire people. You know, and it may be a very simple little thing. You may have attended an event with somebody else, you know, and then you find that somebody is very unhappy because you've done that. They think it may have influenced your decision. You know, those are the kind of things that some folk declared previously in open session don't do anymore, because that means that they would have to leave. You know, and to get that real level of transparency that some of us have always sought to have, that's no longer there for some. Well, no longer there for any.
Yes, the new code did introduce a bar of where the interest was so remote or insignificant. So there was an element introduced there, even for financial interests, actually. So that it was important to do that to avoid having to declare absolutely everything, no matter how remote the matter was from the subject matter under discussion. But I think, Convener, it's very difficult for me to give a view on matters that you're suggesting very specifically without really being aware of the whole circumstances of the individual case.
Okay. Mr. Allen, as is always the case when witnesses like yourself appear in front of the committee, there is quite often a level of interest with the general public. As is always the case, I've had communication round about certain aspects of registration itself. Could I ask you for your opinion in terms of expanding what is registerable? Would you think it would be right that folks should have to register memberships of organisations such as the Masons, for example, which currently, under legislation, they don't have to do?
I think, first of all, and I don't think you're going to be in the least surprised by what I say here, is that these are matters for the legislature, in this case the Parliament, to decide. Let me make one general point, however. Historically, the only interests that people have had to declare have been financial interests. And that is the case, that was the case in local government and is still the case with members of the Scottish Parliament. It's only financial interests that have to be registered. Now, in local government, we now have a system whereby you have to register significant non-financial interests. Now, by the nature of the beast, they are very difficult to determine, very difficult. It is not an easy thing to say what is a non-financial interest that is relevant to a non-financial interest that's not. And it will often depend on the circumstances behind the item of business that's up for discussion there. So I am not the keenest person on non-financial interests being registered, let me put it that way, because I think there is a real difficulty in being sufficiently clear about what you're trying to catch in defining the term non-financial interest. I say that also because at the end of the day, if you do have a non-financial interest that is material to an item of business, it should be apparent to you. And you should be declaring that at the council meeting that's intended to discuss that particular item. So there is a fallback in the public interest and to protect the public so that if someone has a material interest in a matter, he should at the end of the day be declaring it.
Margaret Mitchell, did I see you signalling?
No.
I beg your pardon.
Mr.
Wilson, yeah.
Just to follow up from the point the conveners made about membership of organisations. Now, I've got the SPICE briefing that we received, and I take it, Mr. Allen, you've seen the SPICE briefing because you did make reference to it in response to a question from Margaret Mitchell. If there are issues in the SPICE briefing that you disagree with or are not clear enough, would you be so kind as to advise the committee clerks on SPICE what those issues are?
Absolutely, sir. Yes.
Because clearly, if we as MSPs are looking at this briefing, because I'm looking at the guidance in terms of the Register of Interest and the Code of Conduct, which was published in 2010. And when you look through that guide, it says 12 months prior to taking up office. And at the last point, it says, in this bullet point, it says non-financial interests, including membership of clubs and voluntary organisations. Yeah. Now, if that's in the 2010 code, then the question that the convener asked about membership of a particular organisation, would that not be declarable under this new code?
I think you really need to read the code fully on how it defines non-financial interests rather than with great respect, the SPICE report, because that puts the matter into the full context, actually. But it's not appropriate to be drawn into giving you a view on whether membership of a specific organisation should be registered. It's a matter for the individual councillor to consider, given the context and definition of non-financial interests in the code itself.
I welcome Mr. Allen's response to that, and I did scrutinise the code when it was approved in 2010 as a member of in the last session of the Local Government and Communities Committee, and I have marked that code, and I do have a copy of the code, and I do refer to it regularly in terms of the code for elected members, particularly councillors. But as I said, I would still leave the offer open to Mr. Allen, where he does see that there may be omissions or inaccuracies in the SPICE report, if he could notify the clerks of those, and that could be circulated.
Happy to do so, convener.
Thank you.
That would be grand, Mr. Allen. Could I thank you, Mr. Allen and Mr. Sillars, for your time today. And as agreed, we now move into private session and suspend this meeting for 5 minutes.